Welcome to the Holiday Podcast, where we sit over some freshly baked challah bread every Friday afternoon. I'm your host, Tammy Priest, and it's great to be with you today as we take another look at the intersection of the old and the new. Now, it certainly has been a wild week since we last sat here together. It's been a political, economic, and pandemic roller coaster for sure. And it probably isn't going to get any more calm in the next 25 days leading up to the election, which actually all fits in with what we talked about last week at the beginning of Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, which you may know as the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, you can go back and listen to last week's episode to learn why calling it the Feast of Booths is more accurate and also more meaningful than calling it the Feast of Tabernacles. But last week we talked about the purpose of God's command to live in flimsy little huts for a week. It was to remind his people of their time wandering in the wilderness during the 40 years between Egypt and the Promised Land. To remind them, when they got to the seeming permanence of the Promised Land, that God was still their true protector and sustainer. To remind us all that there isn't anything tangible in this world that truly protects or sustains us. Not our jobs, our relationships, the government, or even our churches. That, to answer the psalmist's question, God is the only place from where our real help comes. Now, when we talked last week about these things, we were just a few hours from the feast beginning. Well, today, we're just a few hours from it ending. And it's been a beautiful week here in North Carolina for people to have been spending time in their sukkahs, their homemade booths, for decorating them with fruit and gourds as a token of the year's harvest, which is the tradition, to express thanksgiving to God for providing the harvest, for all the things that sustained us this year. And really, since it's been such a beautiful week for this outdoor celebration, it's a bit sad to see it end. But the last day is an amazing day, especially during temple times. In fact, ancient rabbis said that if someone hadn't ever experienced the Feast of Booths in Jerusalem, then they had never experienced true joy. Now that phrase, the last and greatest day of the feast, may set off some bells in your head if you're someone who's spent time reading the Gospels. John writes about something Jesus taught on the last and greatest day of the Feast of Booths. Now the fact that Jesus was teaching in the temple court during this feast isn't really unusual, and I'll tell you why. So the Feast of Booths is one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts. These were holidays that were so important to God that he commanded everybody to travel to Jerusalem and gather together at the temple and worship together. The 2 other pilgrimage feasts are Passover in the spring and the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, also known as Pentecost, in late summer. So since the Feast of Booths was a pilgrimage feast, it means that thousands and thousands and thousands of families had traveled and were gathered in Jerusalem. And since there weren't PA systems or video feeds back then, where all the people could watch and listen to the same message like we can today, lots of rabbis would set up throughout the whole temple area, and they would teach whoever happened to gather around them each day of the week-long feast. So John tells us in chapter 7 that Jesus was one of the rabbis teaching that day. But before we dig into what he taught, I want to give you some really important context that most Christians don't know, because it isn't written in the Gospels. And the reason it isn't written is that it's something that everybody would have known back then. Kind of like if I were to write or talk about the 4th of July and talk about the sky being lit up, everyone would know I was talking about fireworks, even if I didn't use that word. Anyways, once you have this context, you'll understand why what Jesus said that day was so revolutionary. So revolutionary that John tells us the people became totally divided after they heard him teach. so revolutionary that a lot of them wanted to have him arrested right then. Well, obviously, to be that divisive, what Jesus said had to be pretty big. So let's talk about this context so we can get this fuller, more powerful picture of exactly what Jesus was announcing to them and to us that day in Jerusalem. So sometime before the exile to Babylon, which was more than 600 years before Jesus came to earth, God's people added a new aspect of worship to the Feast of Booths. I mentioned earlier that a key piece of worship during this fall feast is expressing thanks to God for the harvest. So, as people expressed their thankfulness for the harvest, they also started asking God for plentiful crops in the coming year. And the most deciding factor in the success of agriculture is, yes, rain. So, here's the new piece of worship that the people added. Every day of the week-long feast, a priest would go down the steps of the temple, down the hillside to the pool of Siloam, and he would fill a golden flask with 2 pints of water. And then he would carry it back to the temple, where he would hand the flask to the high priest. Now, through this whole thing, people, all the pilgrim worshipers would follow the priest down the hill to the pool and back, rejoicing in a big procession behind him. Now, the pool of Siloam may sound familiar to you. Its water was considered to be sacred, and it's where Jesus told the blind man to wash to receive his sight after Jesus had made that, awesome paste of dirt and saliva. So anyway, that's the pool of Siloam. And so the high priest would then take this and he would pour it, this sacred Siloam water, at the base of the sacrificial altar on the Temple Mount as a plea for an abundant rainy season in the year ahead. But on the last day of the feast, the water festival reached this fevered pitch. And in fact, when John refers to it as the last and greatest day, he's not making that up or blowing it out of proportion. The last day is actually called Rabbah, great, the great day of the feast. So on this day, all the priests would join the crowd and accompany the water-fetching priest on his march to and from the pool of Siloam, blowing golden trumpets and singing sacred songs the whole way. And then there was an extended prayer for rain that day. And part of that prayer was that God would favor them with abundant water. And the scripture for the great water festival on the last and greatest Rabbah day was Isaiah 12:3. Therefore, with joy, you will draw water from the wells of salvation. And all of that is the backdrop for when Jesus got up to teach that day. So what did Jesus say to the crowd sitting under his teaching that last and greatest day of the feast? After the joyous water drawing ritual and after the prayers for water and blessing and abundance, and after reading the scripture about drawing from the wells of salvation, I'll tell you what he said, as John described it. On the last and greatest day of the festival, John tells us, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." Everything the people had just been praying for, everything that they'd been begging God to give them, Jesus announced that he was the answer to their prayers, that he was the source of living water. And Jesus's Jewish audience didn't need anyone to explain to them the audacity of this particular claim, because in the Old Testament, God described himself as Israel's source of living water. And so, on the last and greatest day of the Feast of Booths, when Jesus announced that he was the source of living water, he was saying in a very Jewish way that he was God himself. In fact, do you happen to know what the Hebrew word for salvation is used in their text that day? With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. The Hebrew word for salvation here is Yeshua, Jesus. With joy you will draw water from the wells of Jesus. Jesus was letting everyone know that if they were looking for salvation, for forgiveness of sin and restoration to God, it will be found in his name, Yeshua. I love moments like this. Moments that when you let things sink in the context of who Jesus was talking to and when he was saying them, it can overwhelm you with awe. I know it does for me. Our God is so intentional with his words and with his timing. So in these crazy days that we're in, I urge you to take heart in that. Take heart in his words, trust in his timing, and draw with joy from the wells of salvation, Jesus himself. Next Friday, over our next braided challah, we'll take a look at the original Read Through the Bible plan. But for now, I wish you a joyful and restful holiday.